Hi, I read 14 books in 2020, which is not a great number, but I tried. I haven't been a great reader for the past handful of years, and I was never a great reader. So for me, 14 books is actually a bit of an accomplishment. So part of my reading list for this year has somewhat of a backstory. When I was a kid, I was homeschooled for most of my life, as were my two older sisters during our compulsory academic years. And every year, for as long as I can remember, we tried to read as many books as we possibly could throughout the year. And what I remember is having a book list and the phrase 25 reading standard, or 25 book standard, 25 book reading standard. That implied that you should be reading 25 books as a youth. I never did. I wasn't that person. I didn't start to get into reading until later. So anyway, the 25 book standard is imbued in my mind, and when my dad retired from teaching, he was an 8th grade English teacher, he had in his classroom this sort of library of young adult books. And when he retired, they came back to the house. They sat there for a while, and in my house, we are a very book-oriented family, so one does not simply dispose of a book. We had to decide what we wanted to do with them. So when you have 10 copies of something, then yes, you can donate, 5 of them. And then you have to decide if you want to keep the rest of them. And we decided that the only way to figure out whether or not we wanted to keep them was to read them. So when my sister and I decided that we wanted to read them, I thought, well, wouldn't it be funny if we brought back our 25 book reading standard for the year 2020? We thought, yeah, that'll be good. And even though we had free time on our hands, at least I had free time on my hands, I read half of what I was supposed to. So I know this 25 book reading standard is kind of silly, and I actually don't even know where it originated from. I thought it was like a statewide thing or county, but I tried to look it up and no information was found. So, with the help of a superfluous piece of paper taped upon my bedroom door and a piece of paper taped upon my sister's bedroom door, I was able to triple, almost quadruple the amount of books I normally would have read. Of the 14 books I read, only 6 of them were a part of the Young Adult Novel Purge Books selection, which will be referred to as Yon PBs in later sections of this video. So the first book that I read was Jacob I Have Loved by Catherine Paterson, who you probably are more likely to know from writing The Bridge to Terabithia, and this book came out in 1980. This book is about a teenage girl named Sarah Louise Bradshaw who lives on Rass Island in Chesapeake Bay, where her father is a fisherman and sailor. At first I wasn't sure how it was going to go, and I think it started a little bit slow for me. I thought that the main character, Sarah Louise, or called Wheeze sometimes, a little harsh at first, but that opinion faded as the book went on. I would still say that she's a fairly rough and somewhat intense sort of girl, internally intense, but I grew to like her very much. I think what kept me reading the book at all was just the world that Catherine Paterson, I hope I'm saying that right, portrayed. There's this depiction of a World War II Maryland island and this strange but very real feeling of a world that's transitioning. I thought the characters were well established and it was immersive. It isn't the happiest book, not that it's tragic. I think that it just touches on some realistic and somewhat uncomfortable emotions, but it's done with enough grace and tact that the book isn't too frustrating or alienating. I ended up liking it a lot, to the extent that I will probably read it again. I give it a 4 out of 5 stars. Moving on, since Jacob I Have Loved was a quote-unquote longer book, and I got through it pretty quickly, but it was still a lot of reading, I decided to choose a shorter book as my next Jan PB. I chose The Cook Camp by Gary Paulson. I think based on its short length alone, I was expecting it to be aimed at a younger audience than Jacob I Have Loved was. It wasn't really inappropriate. There was just in the beginning sort of the inciting events is like the young boy's mother has the gentleman friend over, and the boy kind of, he doesn't say anything, but he knows that something's kind of like going on, and he doesn't like it, and so he ends up going to his grandmother's up in Canada. So his grandmother runs a cook camp, and so she cooks for all of these lumberjacks, essentially, out in the middle of nowhere, but you get the idea that it's kind of just like this big dense forest, and there's not a lot of civilization nearby, and it's kind of it's a cool feeling, like it's isolated, but it's big and mysterious and an interesting setting and much different than what the boy is used to. So these lumberjacks are, you know, large and burly and loud, but they're kind, and the boy is sort of taken aback by them, but he likes them, and he likes the grandmother, who I don't know if he's really met before, but she's strong and she works hard. And again, like in Jacob I Have Loved, we have this interesting world, you know, enormous woods, we're out in Canada somewhere, there's miles and miles between civilization, and it's intriguing and enchanting. And the boy is young and bewildered, and he's trying to process his life in his tiny 5-year-old brain, and then the book ends. I won't tell you how it ends, it just ends. And I was left feeling just like, well, what was the point? Because it wasn't enough of a... There are some books that I think are just meant to kind of showcase a lifestyle or a situation, and they're kind of these gentle portraits. Not every book has to have, you know, a firm, dramatic plotline, obviously, but this felt like it was one of those books that was going to have the plot line, and then it just didn't have the plot line. And I'm like, well, what was this about? Did any change take place? Did we learn anything? I didn't know. And the funny thing is that my sister, within the past couple of months, chose 2 Gary Paulson books as her most recent Jan PBs, and she had the same feeling about both of them. So we've established that Gary Paulson can develop an interesting world. I think they're usually a borderline wilderness kind of world where some kind of a strange job in the wild is executed by an interesting person, and he describes and paints these things well, but then the story just ends and you're just left there alone. So I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars, which may be a little harsh, but that's how I feel. So my third book was The Face on the Milk Carton by Caroline B. Cooney, and for whatever reason, this book seemed familiar to me. I was almost positive that I was familiar with the main concept of the book, and I hadn't read it, and I had not seen the 1995 made-for-TV movie. So small sidebar, I have this book called 101 Things I Learned in Film School by Neil Landau and Matthew Frederick. And it says that a story can be considered high concept if it can be summarized in one sentence. A couple of examples they give are: a billionaire weapons inventor dons an indestructible high-tech suit of armor to fight terrorists, and a curmudgeonly weatherman keeps waking up on the same day. The Face on the Milk Carton can be summarized as thus: a teenage girl sees a missing child photo on the back of a milk carton and realizes it's her own toddler-age photo. This is intriguing, and I was intrigued throughout most of the story. The main girl, Janie, is trying to process what this means and how it's going to affect her life. I probably could have gone for like a little more investigation. There were only a couple of truly investigative parts. A lot of it is her going back and forth between believing that it's her, being sure that this is just kind of some weird mistake or coincidence. And there was a lot of that, and a lot more than I personally needed of that. So I felt that it lacked slightly in the execution, because it just tended to rehash the same things more times than was necessary. And the characters weren't incredibly compelling. They weren't like boring or terribly annoying or anything. They were just kind of. So, there's enough mysterious drama that as the remaining girth of the pages between my fingertips became smaller and smaller, the hard realization dawned on me: we're not going to resolve this story nicely, are we? And I was right. It's the first book of a pentology. So I finished the book, realized what was going on, sat there, wondered if I wanted the other four, and the short answer was no. I wanted it to be resolved in one book, and considering the rampant rehashing of internal monologues that this book produced, I think that would have been possible had the rehashing been replaced with actual plot progression. It's an almost. Of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these. It should have been. 3 out of 5 stars. So since The Face on the Milk Carton was a longer book, I chose a shorter one for my next Jan PB. I picked The Starfisher by Lawrence Yep, and it was published in 1991. It's about a Chinese family in 1927 moving from Ohio to West Virginia to open a laundry business and hopefully lead a decent, prosperous life. In a funny turn of events, the thing that disappointed me about The Face on the Milk Carton is what I wanted more of from The Starfisher. More of the book in general. The book is somewhat anecdotal, but it has these nice, gentle but moving emotions that could have filled 5 books in its own way. It's one of those scenarios that you can just kind of build out on, and I actually liked the characters enough that you could have had a sort of Anne of Green Gables or Little House on the Prairie. It helped that I liked the main character. She's a 15-year-old girl named Joan, and I thought that her internal monologues and thought processes made sense as a girl who was living between the world of her parents and the world she's lived in for most of her life. The drama in the book is that kind of small social drama that I think a lot of people identify with because everybody kind of goes through that. It's about her relationship with her parents, and then she has her younger brother and then much younger sister, and how they are adapting, I think, a little easier into their new environment. And the whole family has to deal with a bit of racial tension, which is very uncomfortable for them, but they're trying hard, and there are some nice people in the town, and they become closer with them. So it's just, it wasn't a large or brilliant book, but I liked it, and I felt that it could have been a series. I would have liked to see where each of the characters would end up going and how their lives would change. I am giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. It isn't brilliant, but I think that it accomplishes what it means to accomplish. And if my main complaint was I would have liked more of it, then anyway, I don't think that's a very big complaint. So now, hard right turn. The next one is not a Yon PB. This book is the first book I ever pre-ordered in my life. The book is called The Voices We Carry, and it's by J.S. Park. It's not fiction. I think it's considered... Amazon ranks it in Christian personal growth, Christian self-help, Christian personal growth, comma, Christian self-help, comma, and motivational self-help in the books category. This is actually the 5th book of J.S. Parks that I own and have read. I discovered him, I think, 4 years ago. J.S. Park, he's a hospital chaplain, and he approaches his Christian self-help in a technical, psychological, but I wouldn't say impersonal way. The Voices We Carry is, to me, his best work to date. It focuses on our emotional and spiritual legacies and inheritances, I will say, based on both what we've developed for ourselves or has been passed down to us from the environment we grew up in. It's a bit of the nature versus nurture thing, which I think is a discussion in psychology as to what goes into the development of our personalities. I wouldn't call it a light read. It's not complex in an overly academic way, which is where I get somewhat hung up on C.S. Lewis, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. But J.S. Park is a hospital chaplain, and he incorporates a lot of real-life stories from deathbed, so it's poignant. I personally found it an enlightening and moving and helpful read, but I read it at a good time for me to read it. And I think that's important with books like this. And I will go into a little bit more of that concept later. So, this one I give 5 out of 5 stars. And I definitely plan to read it again. So, my next book. Okay, I was just talking about, the voices we carry, and there's this emotionalism, and there's a sense of real life meaning coming from a man who has seen so many deaths. It's like, oh wow, and it really gets to you. And then so picture yourself in this situation. You finish that, and then you start reading It's Not the End of the World by Judy Blume, and you just think, you petty, small-minded child with little personality. Backtracking to Jacob I Have Loved, we're dealing with girls of a similar age. Different era. It's Not the End of the World was published in 1972, and it takes place in that era. The family is middle class, doing fine. The main girl is named Karen. Okay, let's compare it to another work from the same era that was also aimed at young adults. Let's talk about the Brady Bunch. We all know that there's not a lot of depth to the Brady Bunch. It's not a secret, we just don't care. It's fun. Greg is way too cool for school and Marcia has groovy outfits. Ultimately, all 6 Brady children want to be good people. Mostly, it's fun, it's fine, we love it. So, take the depth of the Brady Bunch and try to make it a slightly edgy tale of a youth surviving her parents' divorce. Okay, now, I've never experienced this, so maybe I am losing some of the emotional identification. And I know there are probably kids out there who are just as petty and small-minded as Karen, but boy did I not care. I did not like to empathize or even sympathize with one single character in the whole book. I skimmed. I admit it. I skimmed. I just stopped Karen. And this is Judy Blume. She's famous, so they say. So, we have to do one of those things. Based on my research, Judy Blume was known for addressing issues in her books that weren't common to teen reading, like divorce, racism, bullying, iconic milestones of puberty. So if we transport ourselves back to the late 60s and even up to the early 80s, there are probably a lot of topics that got swept under the rug, especially for books aimed at anyone under 16. I understand this significance. If this book is any indicator of how the rest of her books are from the era, then to me, they're designed to make you think about things, but not necessarily make you feel the way you would like to feel towards a book. If you're going through or dealing with some of the subjects that she brings up, then yes, probably there will be some emotional connection just due to your own humanity. But I don't think that she actually created any emotional structure that's moving. She did not build anything. Maybe that was the problem. It was like a DIY emotion book. BYOE. Again, I get that her work is significant, but I found this book annoying. 2 out of 5 stars. I didn't give it 1 star because I probably wouldn't have even finished a 1-star book. Alright, moving on to book number 7. I've discovered that I hate participating in any hyped up material or event while the hype is going on. I grew up on bands that were either no more or their modern versions were irrelevant, shows that had been long canceled, and movies where the cast was mostly probably dead. I don't do hype. It makes me uncomfortable. So when Marie Kondo took the USA by storm following the release of her Netflix show, I was like, yes, interesting concept, duly noted, and then proceeded not to watch it until much later after the hype had calmed way down. Then after I started watching it, I gave up after about 4 episodes because I couldn't stand the people she was helping, which is probably really mean, but I did like her, she just wasn't in it enough. So I gave up on the series and just decided to go straight to the source and read her first book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. In bypassing the hype of Marie Kondo, I've had some time to reflect upon her philosophy. I wrote a pro-Marie Kondo essay for myself several months back as a sort of personal pushback against all of the vilification that she's received. The vilification is odd to me, but several people have seriously called her evil. I personally think that where Marie Kondo falls short is in presentation and execution, at least in the book itself. Taking the book by itself, I think that some of the nuances may have been lost in translation, but even outside of that, I don't know if Marie Kondo approached her explanations with as clear of a structure as I think would have been beneficial. I think her work, method, philosophy are all valuable, but not perfect. And that's just coming from me personally. I can see how her approach would be 100% life-changing for some people. For me, from just reading a book, she provides material that I take with a grain of salt. I could make a whole video or write an essay, which I did, about what I find valuable, but that's not the point here. So I'll leave it at this. 4 out of 5 stars. The fact that I still think about her philosophy after all this time warrants a good deal of value. One does not linger on the insignificant. Following the life-changing magic of tidying up, I read the sequel/companion novel Spark Joy by Marie Kondo. So it's more of a manual than anything. I think I skimmed this one, I admit. I do think it fleshed out some of the concepts from her first book though, which did give me a better understanding of her method. I like her philosophy, but I either disagree with some things or don't fully understand them yet. As a sentimental person, I think that a lot of her advice was unsentimental, but I don't think that she meant it to be. I think that some of her examples didn't settle well with me, and I think where she seems somewhat dismissive, I don't think that that's her intent. I did heartily disagree with her approach to books. As I said before about how my family, we're book people. You keep books. I think most books are valuable and you can never have too many, so her section on how to dispose of them seemed heartless to me. On the other hand, in one of the other sections, or I forget, it might have been in the other book, she talks about how different people have different click points for various objects. And her example was something like 3 pairs of shoes might be a click point for somebody, but for a different person, 36 pairs of shoes might be the click point. I did not support any notion of getting rid of a book after you've read it once. I am a chronic revisitor. I've watched so many movies lots of times, and I've reread books, and I just think that there is value in revisiting things. So that is one thing where I positively will not adhere to that bit of advice. So despite her advice and despite her protest against the practice, I am going to keep both of her books. This one gets 3 out of 5 stars. Returning to Jan PBs, I started, I actually don't know how to pronounce this, Anna of Byzantium? Byzantium sounds right. We're gonna go with Anna of Byzantium by Tracy Barrett. So I started it, read like a page and a half, and then I set it down for several days, picked it back up, and then read the rest of it in one day. So needless to say, based on the fact that I put it down for a while after I read a page and a half, it did take me a little bit to get into. It revolves around Princess Anna Komnene? I don't know. She was a real person, so there is probably a way to actually find out how this is pronounced. And it focuses on her youth, as it begins by being heir to the throne of her father, the Emperor Alexius the First Comnenus. Anyway, so what the book does is follow her journey from being the heir to an empire to ending up in a convent. As far as I can tell, the novel maintains several historical pieces, but it's fiction. Embellishments were made. At first, I kind of found Anna's character to be arrogant and unlikable, but that's kind of the point in the beginning. She's an imperfect heroine, but she's still understandable and relatable. Like Sarah Louise and Jacob I Have Loved, she's a well enough developed character that her flaws aren't alienating and serve a purpose throughout the story. Unlike Karen in It's Not the End of the World, who was both boring and annoying. Deadly combination. I wouldn't say that this book has a happy ending, but there's still a sense of catharsis at the end, which isn't always easy to attain. I would probably read this one again, so 4 out of 5 stars. Yan PBs continue. For as much as I claim that I like fantasy, which isn't an obsessive amount, I am not easily impressed just because there is some kind of presence of fantastical elements. Haunted Waters by Mary Pope Osborne is a retelling of the fairy tale novella Undine by Friedrich de la Montefoucauld. That was written in 1811. The story Undine comes from an actual myth of Melusine. We're going to go with Melusine, and that is at least as old as the 14th century and itself has been passed down and adapted centuries before the Magic Tree House author got her hands on it. I rarely like stories that are based on myths. If the adapting party takes the myth and then just adds some flesh around the main points of the myth, it just doesn't always have its own life to me. It's like you have your first event and there's usually some kind of mystery and awe in response to whatever it is that's just happened, and then events transpire and then something goes wrong, but it doesn't really feel resolved, and then you just feel hollow and sad at the end. It was mysterious, but the mystery never felt like it came full circle. Overall, I found it unsatisfying. It begins, there's some unwarranted and inexplicable romance, there are some mystical incidents, it ends, it's sad, and I am left alone. 2.5 out of 5 stars. Next book. So, I had heard about The Secret History from online venues for like a year, and all I knew is that it was about students and murder. Which isn't a spoiler, both of these things are made clear within the first paragraph of the book. Well now, Secret History was written by Donna Tartt and was her first novel. She's since gained much acclaim from her 2013 release, The Goldfinch. A few things stood out to me in the book. First, we are given the murder within the first sentence. We know who's dead, we know who killed him. This is nothing new, we see it in Columbo all the time. The book unfolds into a riveting how done it and why done it, but this only takes us part of the way through the book, and then we're in the rest of the book. I think I literally had the thought, what, the murder happens now? It's not overly dramatic, but it's also completely dramatic. It's sort of terrible. I don't mean like the writing style or the execution. I just mean like the characters themselves are kind of terrible. The next thing that stood out to me was that I wasn't bored. I started the book assuming that the whole book would be the how-done-it murder mystery type, that I completely did not foresee the second half of the book. The other thing that stood out to me was that I would make it through 20 pages and not even realize that I had turned a page. I would say that's pretty captivating. So this one I'm giving 4.5 out of 5 stars, just because parts of it are so awful. Again, not in quality, just kind of as an observation of human depravity. So speaking of the depravity of human nature, my next book was The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. That was a joke. I admit I really struggled with this one. It's not that the content bothered me or anything, I just think that either C.S. Lewis is too smart or too academic for me at times. I had a similar issue when I read Mere Christianity last year, but it didn't feel as bad as when I tried to read this one. I do think that C.S. Lewis really thrives with the definition of concepts. He categorizes the loves into 4 quadrants, and I am going to try to pronounce them for you while I'm looking at them. The first love is storge. If you read it really fast and let your brain do that thing where it fills in letters, it looks like storage, but I want to guess storge, 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 storga, storge. Empathy. Philia, 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 philia. I just realized, so Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love, and I don't know what the Delphia parts, but like Phila, friendship, brotherly love, Philadelphia. Any word is Greek. Eros, or romantic love. And then the final love is agape, 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 and that's unconditional or God love. He analyzes them from a point of where they are best or if they're over or underdone, and where they falter, with the exception of agape. I enjoyed reading about these concepts, and I found them refining and intelligent when I could understand them. It's possible that I just wasn't in the right mindset, because I do think that can happen, and I think your brain can be in better shape for certain kinds of reading. I don't know if my brain was in the right spot for reading a C.S. Lewis book. This is what I meant though when I was talking about J.S. Park's book and saying that it wasn't overly academic. Maybe academic isn't the best word to describe the 4 loves. I just know I didn't digest it properly. 4 out of 5 stars, which seems really rude, but that's where I am right now. I could read it again because I'm going to keep it even though I already read it, and maybe I'll have a different opinion of it later on. Anyway, yet another non-Yan PB. Crazy Love by Francis Chan is a well-regarded book in modern Christian circles, as far as I can tell. To one extent, I can see why. Christianity and church life can feel stifled and stale, and it seems like a lot of contemporary Christians, especially young ones, are looking for an upfront and true approach to faith. I think Crazy Love's main purpose is to challenge comfortability and bring attention to the radical nature of God's love. And I think it hopes to prompt a similar direction in its readers. So unlike the 4 loves where I felt that I wasn't up to par in an academic or technical reading sense, I feel that I was not in the right place emotionally to read Crazy Love. I think the book wants to shake you out of your dusty norms and comforts, but since I am uncomfortable pretty much all of the time, I found this attempted spiritual earthquake to be depressing rather than inspiring. However, contrary to Marie Kondo's recommendation, I will be keeping it and will probably try to read it again at a later date. Until then, 3 out of 5 stars. So the last book that I read for the year, I had to slip it in quickly, a lot more quickly than I do usually read books. Otherwise, this would only be a video about 13 books, and that is just embarrassing. So the last book that I read is called This Was Hollywood: Forgotten Stars and Stories, and it was written by Carla Valderrama. And this one's new. It's even newer than J.S. Parks, which was released in May, because this one came out in November. So the whole book is various anecdotes of mostly movie stars, but there are a couple of directors from the start of Hollywood up through kind of the golden age of Hollywood. Most of the people that she focuses on are people who were big in the 20s or the 30s or the 40s, or even the teens actually, because she goes into some very early movie stars whom we no longer remember, even though they were huge. I enjoyed this one very much. The author's writing is very straightforward and to the point, but I think she has very good taste on when to make the points she does when she's being to the point. There's a handful of fairly dramatic stuff that she relates, but she doesn't do it in a puffed up or histrionic manner. I don't think she tries to create drama, she just tells the story and trusts that the scenario or situations themselves will create their own drama. There's a natural drama in the content that she gives you. A lot of the stuff in the book did surprise me. I found the book probably like everyone else because I think this is kind of how she started. She runs an Instagram called This Was Hollywood, and it's fairly popular, so you may already follow it. And the same goes for her Instagram. I think she has good taste on pictures that are somewhat unique, or she has a good little story or anecdote to post as the caption. And so it's a very entertaining Instagram. And so when she said she was releasing a book, I decided to buy it. Another thing in the book's favor is that it is very well researched, and the author is very good at denoting, when this was speculation from this person, or this particular thing was something that someone said in an interview at this time, or this is what an article reported at the time. And it forms a kind of composite of what is mostly believed to be true. And she hangs a lantern, and it's not like she's trying to sell you something. It's just, here are all of the stories and viewpoints that went into this situation at the time. A lot of the people I hadn't heard of, or I just didn't know a whole lot about. I think what really did surprise me, especially with a lot of the older movie stars, was just how famous they were at the time, and we don't ever hear about them anymore. And it's not like we don't hear about movie stars from the 20s and 30s. It's just for some reason these people's lives just don't get a lot of traction anymore, and it's just something to think about how big, monumental these individuals were, and now we don't even know their names. It's also a beautiful book. I don't have it with me, but it's so pretty. The layout is gorgeous, and lots of great photos, and the editing and the color coordination, and it's just so pretty. I'm not sure how many times I would sit down and reread the whole entire thing. I think I would read certain chapters over again. I'm gonna give it 5 out of 5 stars. I think that anything that I didn't like, if I want to put it that way, were just things that maybe didn't suit my taste, but I don't think that anything was bad. So, there you go. 14 books, which is quite an accomplishment for me. So here's to hopefully actually reading 25 books next year. Happy 2021 and happy literature.